During my overseas business trip, I received a midnight call from my husband, Brian. "Hey, why don't you divorce me?" I was stunned and could only utter, "What?" I thought this moment might finally come. But I never expected it to happen while I was on a business trip abroad. "What do you mean? Can you explain properly?" Then Brian chuckled through his nose. "You might not have noticed, but I've had a lover. She's younger and cuter than you. Plus, we already have a child together." As I remained silent, Brian continued. "So, I'm going to live with my lover and our child, and I've sold our house and car." He said this proudly, waiting for my response, to which I briefly replied, "Okay." "What?" He must have thought I would break down and cry. That was a naive thought. I had long been prepared, so this wouldn't shake me. A few days later, a frantic Brian was at the airport upon returning home. "My name is Susan Gale. I am a 34-year-old working housewife. I was raised in an ordinary middle-class family in the U.S. and have loved learning Spanish since attending Spanish classes in elementary school. In middle school, I was top of my Spanish class. In high school, I experienced a homestay in Spain. Eventually, I dreamed of working for a multinational company and pursued a degree in business management at a prestigious university. During my studies, I also studied abroad, steadily climbing the steps toward my dream. During job hunting, I worked hard and, although I missed my first choice, I received an offer from my second choice, a multinational company. My family, especially my sister Kathy, was overjoyed. "Way to go, Susan. I'm so proud of you. Take care of yourself when you start working." I nodded and thanked my supportive family. The job turned out to be more demanding than I imagined. Although the company was relatively non-toxic, the quality of work expected was high. And my early 20s involved a lot of overtime. However, I had the support of wonderful superiors and colleagues. And I found great fulfillment in the job I had always wanted. As I dedicated myself to my work over the years, my efforts were recognized, and I gradually took on more important tasks. Friends would say, "Susan is all about her career. You're cool. Such a strong woman." Though they saw me that way, I had a soft spot for cute things. I collected merchandise of my favorite characters and slept with stuffed animals. Since my job was demanding, I gave up on owning pets but often visited cat cafes on my days off to unwind. Although I maintained a professional demeanor at work, I had a strong desire to be comforted, especially because of my busy schedule. As I approached my late 20s, many of my peers married and had children. Invited to a friend's wedding, people would say, "Susan, you should get married soon." But I could only reply, "I'm too busy with work." I was focused on my career and couldn't see any of my male colleagues or business partners romantically. Am I going to be alone forever? But at that time, I was okay with living for my work. One day, I was invited to yet another friend's wedding. As usual, I brought a gift and clapped my hands. Despite my participation, I felt uneasy. I had just turned 30. If I were to consider marriage, it was time to start looking for a partner. The wedding reception continued, and I went to the bar at the venue. While watching the lively participants and the shy bride and groom from afar, I was drinking alone at the counter when suddenly I was approached. "Are you alone? May I sit next to you?" His voice caught me off guard because it sounded like a voice actor's. "That's what you call a nice voice." "Yes, of course." As I responded, I looked at the man who sat next to me. He was about my height, which is tall for a woman, and seemed younger than me. His face was ordinary in a good way, a contrast to his voice. "Are you a guest at this wedding?" I answered, "A friend of the bride." I'm a high school friend of the groom. Would you like to join me for a drink? Nodding, I drank and talked with Brian. Wow, you work at that multinational company. Even I know about it. That's impressive. To me, a regular employee at a small company, you seem like someone from another world. That's how Brian introduced himself, and our conversation flowed. Eventually, we exchanged contacts before parting. Later, we started seeing each other privately. Brian was 2 years younger than me and worked in sales at a small company. He was kind, gentle, a good listener, and good at giving compliments. I enjoyed talking with him. During one of our dates, Brian confessed his feelings, and I happily accepted. His annual income was a third of mine, but that didn't matter to me at the time. As our relationship progressed, I found Brian quite charming. There's a phrase in a drama, "Cute is the strongest," and that perfectly describes him. If you originally thought someone was cool or reliable, there might come a moment when you suddenly feel disillusioned. However, because they are cute, you can forgive the little things. Brian, being younger and always earnest, endeared himself to me. Whenever he asked for a homemade meal, I happily obliged. After a year and a half of dating, Brian presented me with a ring and said, "I've always admired how cool and sometimes cute you are, Susan. I would love it if you'd marry me." Surprised yet delighted, I accepted the ring. Thank you, Brian. I'm looking forward to our life together as husband and wife. Brian cheered, yes, and I smiled at his joy. Later, we visited each other's parents to announce our marriage. Brian's parents were kind, simple folk who blessed our union. My family was generally favorable, and they entrusted me to Brian. My already married sister, Kathy, quietly told me, "He's just the type of guy you'd pick, Susan. But remember, don't spoil him too much." I laughed at her words and replied, "I know." And so, our life together began. I decided to buy a condo at the same time we got married. It was a brave purchase, but thinking of the future, it seemed the better choice. I chose a slightly larger 4-room to accommodate us and any future children. I thought this would mark the beginning of our sweet life together, but I was met with a harsh reality. Brian could hardly do any household chores. Since he had lived with his parents and relied on his mother for housework. I told him understandingly, "Brian, now that we're married, let's share the household duties. If you don't know how, I'll teach you." Brian frowned and replied, "What? Since we're married, shouldn't you, the wife, do the chores?" I firmly responded, "No. My job is demanding. You need to learn to do some housework. Come on, get up. I'll show you how to use the washing machine." Reluctantly, Brian got up, and I began to teach him the basics of housekeeping. However, he frequently shirked his responsibilities afterward. He started doing some cleaning and laundry. But everything was done half-heartedly, and I often had to redo them. His cooking was disastrous, and I ended up making meals in advance to manage. I tried not to discourage his efforts and avoided being harsh. Instead, I praised him even for his incomplete attempts, hoping to encourage improvement. Yet, Brian took advantage of my leniency and started to cut corners even more in his chores. Unable to bear it any longer, I confronted him. "Brian, stop taking advantage of me. You need to learn to do the chores properly. I'm busy with work, and I have trips, so you must be able to manage on your own, right?" Brian's face darkened. "What's up with you, Susan? You've changed since we got married. Always nagging. Since you earn well, why don't we just outsource the housework?" I was astounded. Just because I earned more didn't mean we could frivolously spend money. Despite multiple discussions, Brian's neglect of the chores remained unchanged. One day, a year after our marriage, I came home to find Brian with a pale face. "Brian, what's wrong? You look terrible." He began to explain. "Actually, the company is going bankrupt due to the recession. I'll be unemployed from next month." I gasped in surprise. His overtime had increased over the last 6 months. But I had no idea his company was in such bad shape. "So, what are you going to do now? Any plans for a new job?" "I'll think about it while collecting unemployment benefits. I'm tired, and the mental strain is significant, so let me take my time." I decided to give Brian some space. Considering that unemployment benefits would be coming in, and there was no need to rush. However, once his company went under and he no longer had to go to work, Brian began playing video games all day. Even when I returned home late, the chores were undone. And all I saw was Brian engrossed in his video games. This continued for months, and I grew increasingly frustrated. "Hey, Brian, you've rested enough, right? Isn't it time to start working?" Brian's response was, "I want to think carefully about the next job. In my last job, I was just being exploited. Next, I want something where I can fulfill myself." Though I felt like collapsing in frustration, I couldn't drag a reluctant Brian to the employment office. I continued to look after a languishing Brian even after his unemployment benefits ran out. One day, as Brian was immersed in his games, I sarcastically suggested, "If you love gaming so much, why not try streaming? You might earn some change." Brian's eyes lit up. "That's a great idea. You're so smart, Susan. I'll try doing live streams. I have a good feeling about this." While it was good to see Brian motivated for once, I wondered if this was a positive development. "So, buy me the streaming gear and computer." Surprised, I hesitated, but Brian nonchalantly insisted. "I don't have much savings. I'm serious about this, so please help me out." Reluctantly, I bought the equipment he requested. Even though becoming a streamer isn't easy, I hoped that facing reality would motivate Brian to work seriously. Then, a few months later, the situation took an unexpected turn. Surprisingly, Brian, now known as B, the game streamer, became popular and started ranking in the charts. Online comments like "nice voice" and "his poor gameplay is funny" gathered him a fan base of both men and women. Notably, Brian partially concealed his face during streams and did not disclose that he was married. "See, I told you I can make it. Finally, the world recognizes my worth." Brian was quite pleased with himself. It seemed he had forgotten all about the support I provided, including the equipment I bought to get him started. "It's great that you've succeeded, Brian. So, could you start contributing some of the money you've earned from streaming to our household expenses?" Since Brian's unemployment benefits had ended, he hadn't contributed financially at all. Naturally, now that he was earning, I expected him to contribute. "What? We can live on your salary alone, so why bother? Let's keep our finances separate." I was stunned by his response. But Brian truly began to keep all the money he earned from streaming for himself. By this time, he had lost the sincerity he had during our dating days, and had become completely dependent on me. Around the same time, I purchased a car. Although it was a loan-financed luxury foreign car that I only drove on weekends, I treasured it. "Hey, let me drive your car, Susan." One day, Brian said this, so I asked him, "You only stream from home and don't use it for work, right?" Despite this, Brian insisted, "We're married, so it should be fine." Eventually, I handed over the keys to him. After that, Brian began to go out on his own during weekdays when I wasn't around. Brian's popularity as a streamer continued to rise, and he became well known, leading to a lavish lifestyle and dressing in brand items. I was saddened by the change, Brian. Nevertheless, as we were married, I continued this life for several years. As our 4th year of marriage approached, I was entrusted with a significant position at work and began to travel more frequently for business, whether I was away for a few days or up to 3 weeks. I'd come back to a home that looked more like a garbage dump than a house. Brian would stay holed up in his room, engrossed in his streaming. He still relied entirely on me for a living, and we barely spoke as a couple. I started to wonder why I was still married to him. I then began to gather the necessary documents and prepare for a divorce. One day, I was set to go on a 2-week business trip overseas. Brian, I'm going overseas again tomorrow, so I'll be leaving. I said this, but Brian didn't even respond as he was busy with his phone. Then I boarded my flight and spent the days abroad working hard. However, on the 10th night, Brian called me. Hello, Brian. Consider the time difference, it's the middle of the night here. I said groggily, and then Brian dropped a bombshell. Hey, Susan, let's get a divorce. I was stunned and could only utter, what? I thought this moment might finally come. But I never expected it to happen while I was on a business trip abroad. What do you mean? Can you explain properly? Then Brian chuckled through his nose. You might not have noticed, but I've had a lover. She's younger and cuter than you. Plus, we already have a child together. As I remained silent, Brian continued. So, I'm going to live with my lover and our child, and I've sold our house and car. Brian said this confidently, waiting for my response, to which I simply replied. Okay. Brian muttered, what? He must have thought I would break down and cry. That was a naive thought. I had long been prepared, so this wouldn't shake me. You want a divorce, right? Understood. There's a completed divorce form in the living room drawer, just get it out. As I spoke calmly, Brian tried to act tough. You prepared the divorce form? Good preparation. Well, this is it then. Live miserably as a woman who was dumped by her husband. I almost laughed as I replied. Okay, whatever. I'm going back to sleep. Goodbye. I then hung up the phone on Brian and blocked his calls. After that, I called my sister in the US to arrange something and slept soundly until morning. The next day, I returned to work as usual and worked hard until the last day of my trip. Finally, it was time to go home. The business class seat provided by my company was comfortable, and I fell asleep again. I slept well. Looks like I can get back to my routine without any jet lag. I stretched and disembarked from the plane, feeling refreshed. As I was about to leave the airport lobby. Hey, Susan. I saw someone running towards me. It was a frantic Brian. Oh, what are you doing here? I didn't ask for a pickup. As I said this, Brian started ranting in a half-crazed manner. What are you doing to me? You took the car and the house. Now I was taken aback by his unreasonable behavior. I don't understand what you're trying to say. Can I go now? I'm tired. As I tried to walk past him while yawning, Brian blocked my way. Wait a minute. Listen to me. He shouted, so I stopped. I'll explain everything in order. Well, first of all, I filed the divorce papers after that. Okay. I responded casually, without looking at Brian, as I fiddled with my phone. Are you listening? So, since a real estate agent was supposed to visit to discuss selling the house, I went back home after submitting the divorce papers, only to find a lock on the outside of the door that prevented me from entering. Since there was nothing else I could do, I tried to go to my other house. But there was a padlock on the car tires like an anti-theft lock, and I couldn't drive. I called you, but you didn't answer. You blocked my calls, didn't you? At that point, I sighed. Yes, I blocked your calls, so? Brian turned red and stomped his feet. Did you put the lock on the house and the car tire too? How did you manage that while you were abroad? I casually answered. I asked my sister to take care of it. Brian's eyes widened in shock. Your sister? Yes, you said you sold the house and the car. But when my sister checked, they were still intact. You were probably just bragging about selling them after getting an estimate from the agent, right? Brian's face turned red again. That's true, but everything was set for the sale. And it's all ruined because of you. I became exasperated. No, it wouldn't have been possible to sell them anyway. The house and the car are in my name. And all the necessary documents for the sale are at my parents' house. Brian looked dumbfounded. Seriously, did you think a stranger who isn't even the owner could just sell a house? And a car just like that? Of course, the owner's confirmation is required, and there are documents to handle, right? Brian was at a loss for words. During our marriage, you left all the troublesome paperwork to me. That's why you don't know these basic things. I said dismissively, and Brian glared at me. If you knew it couldn't be sold, why did you lock the house and the car? Because of that, I couldn't enter the house or use the car. It was a huge hassle. I sighed and explained. Who would want someone who's cheating and seeking a divorce in their own house? And the same goes for the car. They're in my name, so I just took measures for security. Brian glared at me with bloodshot eyes. What? That look. Just because you couldn't freely sell my stuff, you make that face? You are unattractive. That's what I hated about you. Acting like you can do everything by yourself, and despite being a woman, you're too presumptuous. I calmly responded. Is that so? Then we shouldn't have gotten married in the first place. Brian snorted. It was obvious I married you for your money. The only benefit of marrying you was your earnings from the multinational company. I could sense the malice from Brian, his desperate intent to hurt me. However, it did not affect me at all. Thinking about it, there was no benefit for me in marrying you. As I said this profoundly, Brian became enraged. What right do you have to act so high and mighty? Damn it, I'm dumping you. My mistress is hundreds of times cuter than you, and she has even had my child. It must be frustrating for you, knowing my mistress is superior to you as a woman. I almost laughed. Superior to me, huh? Brian exclaimed, what do you mean? I pulled a photograph from my bag. This is your mistress, right? Tracy Foster. I showed him the picture of a woman in her early 20s with a cute appearance. Brian's eyes darted back and forth in shock. What? You knew about Tracy. I smiled sweetly and informed him. You weren't the only one who wanted a divorce. I had been gathering evidence for a while. You were careless. Didn't you know the type of dashcam in the car retains video footage? Brian turned pale, but I continued. It was easy to figure out the times you met from the dashcam footage. I just had to ask a detective agency to gather the evidence. It was easy to pinpoint your affair partner, especially since she was already pregnant. As I explained, Brian was stunned, but then he tried to recover. Don't do anything to her. She's having a tough time postpartum. And she's still young with no money. Besides, she didn't know I was married. I exaggeratedly furrowed my brow. You're protective of her. You must love Tracy. Of course. She's pure, cute. She's the one for me. I'll protect her and our child no matter what. As Brian spoke vehemently, I played the video. It was footage from the dashcam. Brian was driving my car, and Tracy, pregnant, was sitting next to him. Brian, thank you for taking me out today. The food was delicious too. As Tracy spoke in a sweet voice, Brian grinned. Tracy, you are good at expressing gratitude. Such a good girl. I can't wait to marry you. As Tracy made a pouting face, she said. It's true. Hurry up and divorce that old lady and become my husband, okay? Our baby is going to be born soon. Just wait a little longer. I'll sort everything out while she's on her business trip abroad. After that, Tracy, you, this child, and I will live happily. We can live luxuriously with the money from selling the house and car. As the video played to that point, I spoke up. Tracy, you knew he was married, didn't you? Brian was pale. To him, I dropped another bombshell. And yet you call that a pure? What exactly do you mean by pure? Brian shouted, what are you trying to say? Here, take a good look. This is what I found when I investigated Tracy. I scattered several photos on the floor, and as Brian looked down at them, his face grew paler. What is this? Who are these men? The photos showed evidence of Tracy being involved with multiple men, intimately linking arms. Entering hotels, and even at an OB/GYN clinic with a man who wasn't Brian. That's the real Tracy for you. She's been targeting famous streamers to establish relationships. You probably started as just a streamer and a fan, right? Brian was speechless, kneeling, clutching Tracy's photo, and looking dazed. Then, in a voice that seemed almost sympathetic, I told him. You're something, raising a child whose father you might not even know. Brian murmured as if in a trance. No way. Tracy told me I was the only one. This can't be happening. I looked down at Brian expressionlessly. He was like a shell of his former self. To him, I finally spoke. Shall I leave then? We are practically strangers now, aren't we? There's nothing more to talk about, right? Suddenly, Brian snapped to attention and screamed at me. If you hadn't shown me this, I could have remained happy. How mean can you get? You've made me distrust everything. I could only respond with an exasperated look. That's none of my business. Do you even hear what you're saying? Well, whatever. Even if I divorce you and break up with Tracy, I'll still be happy. I have over 2 million followers as a streamer now, and I'm earning more money than you. Too bad for you, you're losing a famous streaming husband. Serves you right. Then, with a smile, I suggested. Maybe you should check your phone? Brian said, huh, as he pulled out his phone. Then, his face grew increasingly pale. What? Over 1,000 notifications? What's going on? As he operated his phone, his expression turned to one of shock as he looked at me. Susan, you didn't. With my biggest smile of the day, I said. Yes. I've spilled everything online. About you being married, about your mistress and the child, and how you treated me. Brian let out a scream that echoed through the airport lobby. Everyone's attention was drawn to us. This time, Brian truly lost his composure. What have you done? My reputation. My followers. Messages like worst man ever and a betrayed are flooding in. I playfully held up my phone to him. By the way, this scene is being live-streamed right now. Wow, over 1 million viewers are watching this. Wow. Brian frantically tried to snatch the phone from me, but it was already too late. After all of Brian's disgraceful remarks and his frenzy breakdown were exposed to the public. He began rolling on the floor of the airport lobby. I quietly slipped past him and headed to the taxi stand. Subsequently, Brian ignited a firestorm on the internet. Brian had originally built his reputation as a charming, slightly naive single man with a good voice, attracting many female fans. However, once it was revealed that he was married, his female fans felt betrayed. Additionally, the revelation of his mistress and their child labeled him as unfaithful, which even alienated his male fans and added fuel to the fire. Being married and secretly had a mistress and a child. But the child might not have been his after all. Brian's scandal was a sensation not only among those who knew him, but also entertained others who didn't, turning him into a subject of ridicule online. Despite issuing an apology on social media, Brian's infamy only escalated, leading to a continuous drop in followers and eventually forcing him to pause his activities. Sometime later, after work, I was leaving my office building when, unexpectedly, Brian was waiting for me. Tearfully, he begged me. "I can't stream anymore, I can't even walk outside. Susan, please help me. The truth is, I only truly love you. Let's start over as husband and wife." To his delirious plea, I responded, "If you keep following me, I will call the police." Since then, I haven't seen Brian. I heard through the grapevine that the child Tracy gave birth to wasn't Brian's after all. After a tumultuous saga, Brian and Tracy broke up. I mercilessly demanded compensation from both. Brian paid using his dwindling savings, while Tracy had her parents cover her share. Tracy, having been rejected by another streamer she hoped would marry her, was taken back by her strict parents to raise her child. I hope the innocent child grows up healthy. As for Brian, after paying me compensation, he found himself bankrupt when a company he had partnerships with demanded damages for tarnishing their image. Unable to rely on anyone and out of savings, Brian sought help from his in-laws, who, being decent people, declared they wanted nothing to do with him. Now, Brian, having lost his status, honor, wealth, and his supportive family, reportedly lives in a shabby apartment, virtually a broken man. Despite knowing this, I feel no sympathy for him. As for me, having returned to single life, I continue to dedicate myself to my work. Unwilling to live in the condo I shared with Brian, I decided to sell it. Fortunately, the property's value had increased over the years, enriching me considerably. The car that Brian and Tracy used was also sold to an acquaintance. With the money earned, I bought a new car. After things settled down, my sister, who had helped me, said, "Susan, well done. Treat this whole ordeal as if you were bitten by a dog. And forget about him quickly so you can be happy. But next time, don't choose a man just because he's cute, okay?" You're right, this experience was a lesson. I think I'm done with marriage. Living for my work suits me better. Now, I live in a new single apartment in a high-rise, pet-friendly building. Work has stabilized, so I'm planning to fulfill my long-held dream of adopting a cat. Going forward, I intend to cherish what remains in my life and live positively.